The papers were sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from my afternoon walk. My neighbor Frank had signed for them. I could tell by the sticky note in his handwriting stuck to the envelope. Harold, these came certified. Didn't want them blowing around on your porch. I picked them up, set my coffee mug down, and read the return address twice. Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law, my son's lawyer. I had to sit down. I'd given Michael and his wife Diane $342,000 over the course of 4 years. I'd paid off their combined debt when they came to me 2 months after their wedding, $84,700. Gone, with nothing but a handshake and Michael's word that they'd pay me back when they got on their feet. I'd bought them a 4-bedroom house in the Brentwood area of Nashville for $520,000. Put it in their names as a wedding gift because I wanted my son to have the kind of stability his mother and I had spent 30 years building. I'd been giving them $5,500 a month for 2 years because Diane didn't want to work and Michael's salary as a mid-level project coordinator wasn't enough to cover what she called a reasonable standard of living. And now their lawyer was sending me certified mail. I opened the envelope carefully, the way I do everything since turning 63 deliberately, without rushing. Inside was a 12-page document. The central claim was that I, Harold Eugene Briggs, had been exhibiting signs of cognitive decline and diminished capacity, and that my recent financial decisions, specifically the termination of my monthly support payments, represented evidence of mental impairment that warranted a formal competency evaluation. My son was trying to have me declared incompetent. I read it twice more. Then I called my attorney, Pat Delgado, who I'd known since we served on the same civic planning committee back in 2009. She picked up on the second ring. "Pat," I said, "I need an appointment as soon as possible. My son just filed a motion to have me declared mentally unfit." There was a pause. "Harold, are you serious? I'm holding the paperwork right now. Can you come in tomorrow morning at 8? I was there at 7:50. Pat reviewed the documents while I sat across from her desk and drank coffee that was too strong and too hot. She had the expression she gets when she's reading something that offends her professionally, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness in her jaw. "The basis for this," she said without looking up, "is a letter from a Dr. Raymond Chu, who claims to have conducted a cognitive assessment. Harold, have you ever met a Dr. Raymond Chu?" "Never heard of him." She looked up then. "That's what I thought. This document has problems, significant ones." She set it down and folded her hands. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her about Linda, my wife of 31 years, who died of ovarian cancer 4 years ago after a 14-month fight that left me hollowed out in ways I was still discovering. I told her how Michael had seemed devastated too, or so I believed. How Diane had appeared in our lives about 6 months before Linda passed. Michael had been dating her quietly, and she'd been kind enough at the funeral, attentive, touching my arm at the reception and saying, "Harold, we're going to take care of you." I told Pat how I'd interpreted that as love, and how 2 months later they were sitting at my dining room table with a spreadsheet of their combined debts, and Michael was saying, "Dad, we just need a fresh start." I told her I'd said yes because I was grieving and I didn't know how to say no to my son, and because Linda would have wanted me to help him. That was the story I told myself. Looking back, I think I was buying connection. I was paying not to be alone. I told her about the house and the monthly payments, and how Diane had redecorated the entire house within 6 months, new furniture, landscaping, a custom kitchen renovation that I later found out cost $38,000. I told her how I'd smiled and said nothing, because what was I going to say? I gave them the house. It was theirs. I told her about my granddaughter Sophie, Michael's daughter from a brief relationship years before he met Diane. Sophie was 14 and lived primarily with her mother, but she spent every other weekend with Michael and came to see me every few weeks. She was the best part of my week. She'd sit in my garage while I worked on my woodworking projects and ask questions about everything, how a dovetail joint worked, what kind of wood I was using, why I cared about grain direction. She reminded me of Linda and the way she paid attention to things. And then I told Pat about the morning of February 11th. I'd woken up at 5 in the morning with a pressure in my chest that I recognized immediately. My father had died of a heart attack at 61. I'd been careful my whole life, annual checkups, No smoking, reasonable diet, but I knew what I was feeling. I called 911 myself, unlocked the front door so the paramedics could get in, and sat down on the couch to wait. The ambulance was there in 8 minutes. I was in surgery 4 hours later. It was a significant cardiac event. The cardiologist told me afterward that I'd been lucky I'd recognized it. Lucky I'd moved quickly. Lucky the blockage was where it was, and not somewhere worse. I spent 6 days in the hospital and came home with a handful of prescriptions, orders to rest, and a list of dietary restrictions. Michael and Diane were in the Bahamas. They'd left 3 days before my heart attack, a 10-day vacation that I had, in fact, contributed to, because Michael had mentioned the trip in passing and said they were a little short, and I'd transferred $3,000 without thinking much about it. That was February 8th. 3 days later, I was in a hospital bed. I called Michael's cell from the emergency room waiting area before they took me back. He answered on the 4th ring, and I told him what was happening. And he said, "Dad, are you sure it's serious? You've had chest pain before." I told him the paramedics were saying it was serious. He said he'd call me back. He called back 2 hours later, while I was in pre-op. A nurse held the phone to my ear. Michael said they'd looked into changing their flights, but the airline fees were significant. He mentioned a figure, something over $800 per person, and the resort had a no-refund policy. He said he'd spoken with Diane, and they agreed the doctors were there, and there was nothing they could do that the medical staff couldn't, and they'd come see me as soon as they got back on the 18th. "We'll be there the minute we land, Dad." "I promise." The 18th. I was having open-heart surgery on the 11th, and my son was promising to see me on the 18th. Frank was at the hospital by 11 that morning. Frank Okafor, my neighbor and the closest thing I had to a best friend since Linda died, drove himself to Vanderbilt Medical Center and sat in the waiting room for 5 hours during my surgery, and was the first face I saw when I woke up in the ICU. He was 68 years old, and he'd had his own knee surgery the previous fall, and walking long distances still gave him trouble, and he sat in a plastic hospital chair for 5 hours. Michael and Diane arrived on the evening of the 18th, tanned, carrying duty-free bags. They came to my house, where I'd been home for 3 days already. Under Frank's informal supervision, Diane hugged me carefully, said I looked good, asked if I'd lost weight. Michael sat across from me and said, "Dad, I'm really glad you're okay." I looked at my son and I thought about Linda. I thought about how, the last week of her life, Michael had slept on a cot in her hospital room every single night, how he'd held her hand for hours and read to her from the novel she'd been working through when she got too tired to hold the book. I'd believed, watching him do that I'd raised a good man. I didn't say anything that evening. I let them visit for an hour, accepted the bottle of rum they'd brought from Nassau, and watched them drive away. Then I went to my study and sat at my desk for a long time. The next morning I called Pat Delgado for the first time, not about any legal trouble, just to update my will. I wanted to make changes I'd been putting off. After that call, I called my bank. I stopped the monthly transfer to Michael and Diane's account. $5,500, gone from their lives as of the 1st of March. Diane called me 9 times on March 2nd. I answered the 3rd call. "Harold, there's been some kind of error with the transfer." "No error," I said. "I've decided to stop the payments." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The warm, careful tone she usually used with me had an edge to it now, like a blade that had been waiting under a tablecloth. "Harold, that money is how we manage the mortgage. We budget around it. You can't just—" "The house has no mortgage," I said. "I paid cash." "Harold." The edge sharpened. "Michael and I have structured our lives around." "I know," I said. "That was a mistake on my part. I'm correcting it." I ended the call. Michael called that evening. He was calmer than Diane, but I could hear her in the background, a low, insistent murmur. He talked about the unfairness of it, the lack of warning, the financial disruption. He didn't mention the hospital. He didn't mention February 11th. He talked about their expenses, the property taxes coming up, the cost of maintaining the house, Diane's various commitments. He talked for 11 minutes, and at no point said the word sorry. When he finally paused, I said, "Michael, I had surgery while you were on a vacation I helped pay for. I'm not going to explain this further." He went quiet. Then, "That's not fair, Dad." I know you believe that, I said. Good night. The following weeks were quieter than I expected. Sophie came to visit on a Saturday, and we spent the afternoon in my garage, where I was working on a blanket chest I'd been building from white oak. She handed me tools and asked whether I was really in a fight with her dad. I told her it wasn't a fight. Exactly, it was a reckoning. She thought about that for a moment, turning a hand plane over in her palms. Diane told me you were being unfair to them, she said. What do you think? I asked. She set the hand plane down very carefully. I think you went to the hospital and Dad didn't come. She paused. I would have come, Grandpa. If someone told me, I would have come. I believed her completely. The certified mail from Whitmore and Associates arrived 6 weeks after I stopped the payments. Pat moved quickly. She filed a formal response contesting the competency petition, requested disclosure of Dr. Raymond Chu's credentials and the basis for his assessment, and submitted documentation of my recent medical evaluations, all of which confirmed I was, in every measurable way, mentally sound. Dr. Chu, it turned out, was a chiropractor in Murfreesboro with no training in neurology or psychiatric assessment. His letter described a patient he'd supposedly examined for 45 minutes in his office. I had never been to his office. I had never met Raymond Chu. Pat forwarded our response to the Tennessee Board of Health as well as the State Bar Association, noting that an attorney had submitted a fraudulent medical document as the evidentiary basis for a legal petition. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late April. I wore the charcoal suit I'd worn to Linda's funeral, and then to her memorial service a year later, and then to Pat's daughter's wedding the spring after that. It was the suit I wore when things mattered. Frank drove me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, a hearing room. Really. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lights, a judge who looked like she'd seen every variety of human foolishness and was not particularly interested in being surprised by new ones. Judge Barbara Ellerby. I'd done my small amount of research on her. She'd been on the bench for 19 years. She coached a youth soccer team on weekends. She did not appear to suffer nonsense. Michael and Diane sat at the petitioner's table with their attorney, a man named Greg Whitmore, who had the practiced confidence of someone who files nuisance suits professionally. Michael was in a new suit, expensive, charcoal, with a faint stripe. I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes. Diane sat very straight, composed, in a cream blazer, looking like a woman who had practiced looking reasonable. Judge Ellerby reviewed the filings for several minutes without speaking. The courtroom was very quiet. She looked up at Whitmore. Counselor, the medical documentation you've submitted in support of this petition is from a chiropractor. Whitmore shifted slightly. Dr. Chu has broad experience in... He's a chiropractor, the judge said. He has no credentials in cognitive assessment, neurology, or psychiatry. His letter describes an examination of your client's father that, according to your own client's father, never took place. Do you understand the position that puts you in? Your Honor, if I could explain the context, I'd actually rather hear from your clients directly. She turned her gaze to Michael and Diane. Mr. Briggs, you filed this petition. Tell me what observations of your father's behavior led you to believe he was cognitively impaired. Michael stood. He was 38 years old, and he looked, in that moment, like a teenager who'd been caught. Your Honor, my father made a sudden and significant change to his financial arrangements without explanation. And he stopped giving you money, Judge Ellerby said. It was disruptive and out of character, and we were concerned. When your father had a cardiac event in February, you were in the Bahamas. Is that accurate? A pause. Yes, Your Honor, and you did not return. The flights were. Yes or no, Mr. Briggs? No, Michael said. We did not return. Judge Ellerby looked at him for a long moment. It was the kind of look that doesn't require elaboration. Then she turned to where I sat and said, Mr. Harold Briggs, would you like to address the court? Pat had told me to keep it brief. I stood, and I said, Your Honor, over 4 years I gave my son and his wife approximately $342,000 in direct financial support. I did this freely, because I wanted to. When I had open-heart surgery in February, they remained on a vacation I had partly funded, and did not return until 7 days later. I stopped the monthly payments because I realized I had confused financial generosity with a family relationship, and I no longer wished to do that. That is the extent of my mental impairment. There was a silence. Judge Ellerby said, The petition is denied. Mr. Harold Briggs is manifestly competent. Furthermore, given the fraudulent nature of the medical documentation submitted in this proceeding, I am ordering the petitioners to cover the respondent's legal costs, totaling $9,400, payable within 45 days. I'm also referring Dr. Raymond Chu's letter to the State Medical Board and the filing attorney to the Bar Association for review. She looked at Whitmore. Counselor, I have been on this bench for 19 years. I want you to understand that I can recognize a case built on desperation when I see one. You should have known better than to bring this here. The gavel came down. Pat squeezed my arm as we stood. Across the room, Diane was speaking in a rapid, low voice to Whitmore, who was nodding and gathering his papers with the careful efficiency of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. Michael was standing very still. As Frank and Pat walked me toward the door, Michael turned and looked at me directly for the first time all morning. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. In the parking lot, Frank clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You want to get breakfast?" "I could eat," I said. We went to a diner on Charlotte Avenue where the coffee was good and the booths were wide and nobody cared what you talked about. Pat had to get back to her office, but she shook my hand at the door and said, "Harold, they've got 45 days on that payment. If they miss it, we move to collection. Lien on the house. The whole process. They don't have $9,400, I said. She smiled slightly. "No, I don't imagine they do." Frank and I sat in the booth for an hour. He ordered the eggs and toast he always ordered, and I had oatmeal with fresh fruit, which is what my cardiologist has me eating now. And we talked about everything except what had just happened, which was how Frank and I operated. He told me about his daughter's new job in Atlanta. I told him about the blanket chest, which I'd finished the week before, and was planning to give to Sophie for her 15th birthday in June. When we finally got up to leave, Frank said, "You holding up okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." The weeks that followed had a different quality of quiet from before the hearing. Before, the silence from Michael and Diane had felt like the gathering of pressure before a storm. Now it felt like aftermath, like the stillness after something has finally broken and the air has settled. Sophie called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice careful and low. "Grandpa, are you watching the news?" "No, sweetheart. What's wrong?" "Mom and Diane had a huge argument about me coming to see you. Diane said you were. She called you something I don't want to repeat." Dad just sat there. "Are you okay?" "Yeah. I'm at home with my mom." A pause. "Grandpa, why does Diane hate you so much?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without burdening a 14-year-old with more than she needed to carry. "She doesn't hate me," I said finally. "She hates what I stopped doing for her. Those are different things." "That's a really sad way to be," Sophie said. "It is," I agreed. 2 months after the hearing, Sophie told me that Diane had started working. She'd taken a position managing the front desk at a medical practice, something she'd apparently resisted for years, on the grounds that she hadn't gone to college to answer phones. The property tax bill on the Brentwood house had gone unpaid. Michael had quietly reached out to a financial counselor through his company's employee assistance program. And then, on a Saturday morning in late July, my doorbell rang. Michael was standing on my porch alone. No Diane. He was wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, the most underdressed I'd seen him in years, and he looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. His face was thinner. He was holding a paper bag that turned out to contain 2 cups of coffee from the place on my street that I used to take him to when he was a kid. "I didn't call first because I thought you might not answer," he said. "You might be right," I said. "Come in." We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd opened his lawyer's certified letter, and he wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at the grain of the wood for a long moment before he spoke. "I want to start at the beginning," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if I stop, I don't think I'll get through it." I nodded. He told me he knew, even in the moment, that staying in the Bahamas was wrong. He told me that Diane had made the argument, the flights, the resort fees, the doctors being there, the practical logic of it, and that he had let her make it because it was easier than confronting her. He said he'd been doing that for years, letting her make arguments that he knew were wrong because confronting her required an energy and a willingness to endure her anger that he'd never been able to sustain. He said that when he got off the plane on the 18th and drove to my house and saw me thinner, moving carefully, The scar beneath my collar that I hadn't thought about, but that he'd noticed immediately something had shifted in him that he hadn't been able to name. He said it had taken him months to understand what it was. I was ashamed, he said, and I didn't know how to be ashamed and still be with her, because being ashamed meant admitting I'd made the wrong choice, and she didn't believe we'd made the wrong choice. She thought you were being punitive. She thought the payments stopping were the real injury, not the other thing. He looked up. She's still living in the house, by the way. We're separated. She won't leave. Her lawyer says she has rights to the property. She might be correct. I waited. I'm not here to ask you to fix this, he said. I know I don't get to ask for that. I just needed to sit across from you and tell you that I understand what I did, and that I understand why everything that happened after happened. You were right. About the money, about what it became, about all of it. He exhaled slowly. I used to tell myself it was love that you gave because you loved me, which was true, but I didn't love you back the way you deserved. I loved what you provided, and I let Diane reinforce that because it was convenient. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started up, ran for a moment, then stopped. I said, "When your mother was dying, you slept on a cot in her room for 7 nights in a row." He blinked. "I watched you do that," I said. I thought I'd raised a man who showed up for the people he loved, and I carried that with me for 4 years, even as things were going sideways. I kept thinking, that's who my son is. He shows up. Michael's jaw tightened. He was trying not to cry, or perhaps past that the particular stillness of a man who's been through enough that tears feel like an indulgence he can't afford. You let someone take that out of you, I said. That's the part that's hard for me to forgive. I know. I don't know if I'll be able to. I know that too. We sat there for a while. I refilled my coffee. I asked him about his situation, the separation, the house, his finances. He laid it out plainly, without the self-pity I might have expected. He'd started saving aggressively. He'd moved into a rental apartment near his office, modest, functional, nothing like the Brentwood house. He was paying down the credit card debt that had accumulated during the period when my payments were their cushion and they'd spent on top of it anyway. His company had given him more responsibility. He was working harder and more honestly than he had in years, he said, as if the removal of the financial floor had reminded him he had legs. Sophie said something to me, he added quietly. After the hearing, she said, "Dad, Grandpa went to the hospital and you didn't come back." And she said it the way kids say things, no drama, just the fact of it. And I couldn't answer her. "What did you say?" I said I was sorry. She said okay. And then she asked if she could go see you. And I said yes. He paused. That's the most useful thing I've done in a long time. I thought about Sophie at my workbench, turning the hand plane over in her small, careful hands. I thought about the blanket chest in my garage, finished and sanded, waiting. "I'm not changing the will," I said, "not back to what it was. If that changes down the road, you'll have to earn it." "I understand. Sophie's education is already taken care of. I set up a trust for her last year. That's not conditional on anything. It's hers." He nodded, and something in his face shifted in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not relief, he'd made clear he wasn't here for relief. Something closer to gratitude of a different kind, the kind that doesn't want anything back. "There's one more thing," I said. "I want you to come to dinner on Sundays, you and Sophie, when it's your weekend with her. Frank usually comes too. We cook, we eat, we don't talk about money or lawyers or any of this. Can you do that?" Michael looked at me. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." "All right." He stood up, held out his hand. I shook it, the same deliberate, provisional handshake I'd seen my own father give men who were working their way back to something. Not absolution, not the past. Just a door held open an inch. After he left, I went to the garage. The blanket chest was sitting on my workbench, where I'd left it white oak, hand-cut dovetail joints at all 4 corners, a cedar lining that would keep the contents smelling clean for decades. I'd spent 60 hours on it over 3 months. I ran my hand along the top panel, feeling the smoothness of the final sanding, the slight warmth the wood held from the afternoon light through the garage window. Frank came by around 5, as he sometimes did. He looked at the chest, then at me. "How'd it go?" "He came," I said, "by himself. He sat down and told the truth. Frank considered that. You believe him? I think so. Time will tell. That's all you can ask. He picked up the small wooden mallet I'd set on the bench and turned it in his hands. You know what Linda would say. She'd say, give him a chance. She'd say, give him 2 chances, Frank said. And she'd be right, and you know she'd be right. I laughed, a real laugh, which still surprised me sometimes, the way it came back when I wasn't expecting it. Don't invoke Linda when you're making a point. That's not fair. I'll use every advantage I have. I picked up the chest, carried it to the corner shelf where I stored finished work. It was heavy and solid, the kind of thing made to outlast the person who made it. I thought about Sophie using it, decades from now, putting blankets in it, or winter sweaters, or whatever mattered to her, showing it someday to someone she loved and saying her grandfather made it. I thought about what it means to build something that lasts versus something that looks like it lasts. The house in Brentwood was beautiful, 6,000 square feet, vaulted ceilings, a chef's kitchen that nobody cooked in. I'd paid $520,000 for it, and it had housed resentment and convenience and a marriage built on my checkbook. The chest was worth maybe $400 in materials, and it would be standing long after that house was renovated past recognition. There's a lesson in that, though I'm not going to claim I figured it out before it cost me. That evening I sat on my back porch with a glass of water and watched the light go down over the ridgeline. Nashville in late summer is heavy and green, and the air holds the heat of the day long after the sun is gone. Linda had loved this porch. We'd spent hundreds of evenings out here over the years, not saying much, just being in the same place at the same time, which is its own kind of richness. I thought about the 4 years since I'd lost her. The grief, the loneliness, the way I'd poured money into my son's life, as a way of staying connected to something, staying necessary, staying present. I understood it now in a way I hadn't while I was doing it. I'd been trying to buy a relationship with the only remaining piece of the family Linda and I had built together. I'd handed Diane the receipts and trusted Michael not to let her cash them in. That was on me. I knew that. I'd said as much to Pat when we first started working on my case, and she'd looked at me carefully and said, Harold, understanding your part in something doesn't make what they did acceptable, which was true, and which I had to hold in both hands simultaneously without dropping either side. I wasn't absolved, but I wasn't a fool. Either or, I didn't have to keep being one. The following Sunday, Michael arrived at my door at 4 o'clock with Sophie, who was carrying a pie she'd made herself peach, from a farmer's market, slightly lopsided and perfect. Frank came at 4:30 with his good bottle of bourbon that he only brought to occasions. We cooked on the grill out back, 4 of us, and ate on the porch as the sun went down. Michael helped me clear the dishes without being asked. Sophie told Frank about a history project she was working on, something about the labor movement in the 1930s, and Frank told her 3 stories about his father's involvement in a union in Lagos that were probably only partly true but were completely riveting. I sat at the head of the table and looked at the 4 of them and thought about what Frank had said about Linda. She would have given Michael 2 chances. She would have stood in this kitchen and said, of course you give him another chance, Harold. He's your son, but you do it with your eyes open this time. She would have been gentle about it and absolutely implacable, and she would have been right. I was trying. Diane, as far as I knew, was still in the Brentwood house. The separation agreement was still being negotiated. Michael's attorney, a different attorney than the one who had sent me certified mail, had filed the necessary paperwork. It would take time. These things always did. The $9,400 in court costs hadn't been paid. Pat had begun collection proceedings. A lien had been filed against the property. It was mechanical now, the legal system doing what it did, and I found I had no particular feeling about it one way or another. Not satisfaction, not guilt. Consequences are just what happens when you make choices. I'd made mine, Michael had made his, Diane had made hers, and here we all were, living inside them. After dinner, while Frank and Michael were talking on the porch, Sophie came inside and found me washing dishes at the sink. She stood beside me and picked up the drying towel and started drying without being asked the same way she always had, ever since she was 8 years old and barely tall enough to reach the counter. Grandpa, she said. Yeah. Is it going to be okay? With you and Dad? I thought about the honest answer. Not the reassuring one, not the easy one. Sophie was 14, and she'd sat in my garage and told me she would have come to the hospital, and she deserved honesty. I think it might be, I said. It's going to take a while, and it'll be different than it was. Different how? Better boundaries, I said. More honesty. Less pretending things are fine when they're not. I handed her a bowl to dry. Your dad and I are going to have to learn how to be around each other again. That takes time. But you're trying, she said. We're trying. She considered that, drying the bowl carefully. Then she said, I think that's enough. When people are really trying, I think that's enough to start with. 14 years old, 31 years of marriage and 4 years of hard lessons, and a 14-year-old had said the thing I'd been trying to get to. Yeah, I said. I think you're right. She put the bowl away in exactly the right cabinet she'd always remembered where everything went, and folded the dish towel over the handle of the oven door, the way Linda used to do it, which I'd never mentioned to her, but which she'd apparently absorbed from some early visit when she was small enough to still be carried. Outside on the porch, Frank was laughing at something Michael had said. That big, full laugh of his that carried through walls. The screen door was open, and the evening air came through, warm and green-smelling. The Nashville summer doing what it does. I stood at my kitchen sink in the house Linda and I had bought in 1994, in the life I was slowly figuring out how to rebuild, and I thought, this is enough. Not everything I wanted, not the whole thing, but enough to work with, enough to build from, enough to be grateful for. On the way out, Michael stopped on the porch and said, Same time next week? Same time next week, I said. I watched them walk to his car, Sophie talking about something, gesturing with her hands the way she did, Michael listening with his full attention, the way he used to before the years of convenience had taught him half listening was sufficient. He held the car door open for her. He glanced back at the porch once and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Frank stood beside me as the car pulled away. Well, he said. Yeah, I said. Linda would be pleased. Don't push it, Frank. He laughed. We went back inside, and I put the kettle on for tea, and the evening settled around the house like something earned.